My father shouted, "Get out, tomorrow starts year 2026, and nobody objected. Not my stepmother who had been counting the days until I became disposable, not my uncle who lived off favors, not my half-brother who had learned early that silence was the safest way to inherit power. The room didn't feel angry, it felt resolved, like a verdict delivered long before the accused was allowed to speak. I remember noticing how calm everyone looked, how rehearsed the disappointment was, how efficiently my existence was being erased. My father didn't insult me, didn't list failures, didn't even raise his voice after that first command, because I wasn't worth the effort of explanation anymore. He said 2026 was a reset year, that emotional baggage couldn't be carried forward, that leadership required pruning, and that I had never grown into anything useful. When I asked what I was supposed to do, he said adulthood meant figuring things out alone, then turned away as if the conversation had already ended in his head. I packed one bag because security was already nearby, because the house no longer recognized me as family, because every object suddenly felt like evidence I wasn't allowed to keep. My car declined at the gate, my name disappeared from the driver's schedule, and I realized with a clarity that burned that this had been planned quietly, legally, and without remorse. That night I slept in my car while fireworks announced a new year to people who had never questioned whether they deserved it. By morning the story had been rewritten without me. Friends stopped replying. Industry contacts went silent. Headlines framed my exile as a choice, a personal journey, a graceful exit, because my father's influence didn't just control businesses, it controlled narratives. Nobody asked where I was staying, how I was surviving, or why I hadn't been seen since midnight. I understood then that invisibility wasn't an accident, it was a function of power. What they didn't know was that my mother had seen this ending long before it happened. She had been dismissed, underestimated, talked over, quietly sidelined until she chose silence as armor. When she died, she left me an envelope with instructions I hadn't understood until that morning when I opened it inside my car with shaking hands. There was no affection in her words, no apology for leaving me in that family, only preparation. A flash drive held years of documentation revealing that while my father had been building loudly, she had been building deeply, through trusts, shell entities, land acquisitions, and strategic partnerships so obscure that even forensic accountants would struggle to trace them. She had never tried to compete with him publicly because she understood something he never did, that dominance attracts enemies while quiet ownership attracts time. One file contained coordinates instead of an address, another contained security protocols, another contained valuation reports that made my stomach drop. When the call came, the man on the line spoke like someone who had been waiting years for this moment, telling me my mother had anticipated rejection as the trigger for transfer, that the assets were dormant until I was officially cut off, and that everything was now live. The next day I stepped onto a helicopter while my family finalized press releases about my supposed independence, and hours later I stood on an island I legally owned, an island designed not for luxury but for permanence, with its own power grid, data infrastructure, airstrip, port, and stone fortress engineered to outlast governments. I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I understood immediately that revenge wouldn't come from rage, it would come from patience. Over the next year I studied everything my father controlled and everything he ignored. I learned where his company was vulnerable, where it relied on third parties, where arrogance had replaced redundancy. I invested quietly through proxies. I bought debt before it became leverage. I positioned myself inside supply chains, financial backstops, licensing channels, and digital infrastructure without ever attaching my name. When contracts failed, he blamed markets. When banks hesitated, he blamed regulation. When partners pulled out, he blamed loyalty. He never suspected me because in his mind I was still the useless child he had discarded. When he invited me to dinner under the guise of reconciliation, it wasn't because he missed me, it was because desperation had finally outrun pride. I arrived calm, controlled, unrecognizable not because I had changed who I was, but because I no longer needed his approval to exist. When I placed the documents on the table and watched recognition spread across his face, it wasn't anger I felt, it was relief. Relief that the truth was finally unavoidable. He asked how long I had been involved. I told him since the night he told me to leave. My stepmother cried not because she regretted anything, but because she understood power had shifted and she was no longer protected by proximity. My half-brother apologized without meeting my eyes, already calculating survival. My father said he hadn't known, that he would have done things differently. I told him that ignorance wasn't an excuse, it was his greatest flaw, that he had mistaken control for vision and fear for respect. I didn't threaten him, I didn't demand anything, I simply stood and walked away knowing his empire would survive but never dominate again, reduced to something smaller, something dependent, something permanently aware of what it lost. Now every New Year's Eve I stand on the balcony of my island castle listening to waves crash against cliffs older than his legacy, watching fireworks from cities that don't know my name, remembering the night I was expelled like a liability, and understanding with absolute certainty that the moment they thought they destroyed me was the moment they finally set me free. The weeks after that dinner were when the real punishment began, not because I acted aggressively, but because I stopped acting at all. Silence is unbearable to people who are used to control. My father called twice the first week and left voicemails that sounded composed but smelled of fear, asking for meetings, proposing compromises, pretending this was a misunderstanding that could be corrected with enough discussion. I never replied. The second week, lawyers reached out with neutral language and urgent calendars, suggesting mutually beneficial restructures, shared oversight, joint press appearances. I declined through intermediaries without explanation. By the third week, the tone changed. Accusations surfaced quietly in private channels, hints that I was being unreasonable, that family mattered more than contracts, that what I was doing bordered on betrayal. That was when I knew it was working. I hadn't taken anything from them that wasn't already mine, but they felt robbed because for the first time they were powerless to rewrite reality. Inside their company, uncertainty spread like rot. Executives stopped making decisions without triple confirmation. Partners delayed commitments. Employees whispered. Markets don't react to collapse, they react to doubt, and doubt was now everywhere. I watched it all from a distance, not with joy, but with precision. My mother's documents had included contingency paths for moments like this, outlining when to tighten pressure and when to let it breathe so nothing snapped too visibly. I followed them exactly. When my father attempted to bypass one of the controlled suppliers, I allowed it, knowing the alternative would cost him more. When he tried to secure emergency financing, I stepped aside just long enough for the terms to become humiliating. I didn't want him ruined. I wanted him aware. The stepmother reached out next, not with threats but nostalgia, reminding me of childhood moments that had never actually happened, inventing warmth she had never offered, framing cruelty as misunderstanding. I listened once, said nothing, and ended the call. After that, she stopped pretending. My half-brother sent a message apologizing again, asking how to protect his position, offering loyalty like currency. I ignored him too. Loyalty offered under pressure is just fear in disguise. Months passed. My father's public image remained intact, but privately his world had shrunk. Invitations stopped arriving. Deals stalled indefinitely. His name still carried weight, but no longer momentum. Meanwhile, my own operations expanded quietly. I didn't brand myself. I didn't give interviews. I let other names take credit while I controlled outcomes. On the island, systems evolved. Infrastructure grew smarter. Security became invisible. I trained myself not to react emotionally to updates from the mainland. Revenge isn't about satisfaction, it's about permanence. One afternoon, I received a final message from my father, shorter than the others, stripped of authority, almost human. He wrote that he finally understood my mother, that he had underestimated silence, that if he could undo one decision, it would be the night he told me to leave. I read it once and deleted it. Regret after consequences isn't wisdom, it's grief. On the last day of the year, as preparations for another global celebration filled the airwaves, I stood again on the balcony of the castle, listening to the sea below, thinking not about them but about myself, about the version of me that had stood in that living room waiting for approval that was never coming, and realizing that person no longer existed. They had tried to end my story before 2026 began, but all they did was remove themselves from it. The year that followed unfolded with a quiet inevitability that would have terrified my former family if they had understood it. I began to appear in places without ever being seen, my influence felt but never attributed, decisions shifting markets before names were attached to them. My father's company survived, but survival is a humiliating state for men who once believed they were untouchable. Every quarter report grew thinner, every board meeting longer, every victory smaller than the last. He tried once more to regain control by reshuffling leadership, promoting loyalty over competence, but loyalty fractures fastest under pressure. Executives began protecting themselves instead of the company. Departments stopped sharing information. The organism that had once moved as a single body became a collection of nervous limbs. I allowed it to continue because entropy is more effective than force. Meanwhile, I expanded beyond what even my mother had envisioned. The island became a hub not just of privacy but of influence, hosting discreet negotiations between people who understood the value of anonymity. I learned how power actually moves, not through speeches or threats, but through timing, access, and restraint. There were nights I remember the living room where I had been dismissed, the polished floor reflecting my father's certainty, and I realized how small that world had been. One afternoon, news reached me that my father had suffered a mild collapse during a meeting, nothing dramatic, just the body reacting to sustained loss of control. He recovered quickly, but something in him didn't. He stopped speaking publicly. He delegated more. He aged faster. My stepmother withdrew from society, unable to perform confidence without the assurance of dominance. My half-brother accepted a lesser role elsewhere, carrying my father's name like a weight instead of a shield. None of them contacted me again. They didn't need to. The silence between us said everything. On another New Year's Eve, as the calendar prepared to turn once more, I stood alone at the edge of the balcony, the ocean dark and endless beneath me, and understood the final truth of it all. Revenge isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself or demand witnesses. It simply replaces the world that once rejected you with one that never needs them again. Time did what no confrontation ever could, it made the separation irreversible. I stopped checking updates about my father's world not because I forgave anything but because relevance had shifted. The island became routine, not in luxury but in responsibility. I woke early, reviewed operations, signed approvals that shaped outcomes continents away, and ended days watching tides instead of news feeds. Power without noise creates a different kind of calm, one that doesn't spike adrenaline but settles into certainty. Occasionally, fragments of my old life drifted in through third parties, a mutual acquaintance mentioning how my father now spoke cautiously, how meetings that once ended with decisions now ended with postponements, how people deferred to consultants instead of vision. I never asked follow-up questions. I didn't need details to understand the trajectory. One evening a courier delivered a physical letter, something so outdated it immediately caught my attention. The handwriting was my father's. He wrote about legacy, about mistakes, about how he used to believe strength meant never admitting uncertainty. He said he finally understood that the night he told me to leave wasn't an act of leadership but fear disguised as authority. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked for acknowledgement. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer I never opened again. Closure isn't something you give to people who only learn empathy after consequences. The following months solidified everything. My network stabilized, my holdings diversified, my anonymity became intentional rather than accidental. Governments negotiated through intermediaries. Corporations adapted around structures they couldn't see. The island ceased to feel like refuge and became simply home. On the anniversary of the night I was expelled, I didn't mark it publicly or privately. I didn't need rituals to remember. The memory lived in my posture now, in the way I no longer flinched at raised voices or measured my worth against approval. Somewhere far away, a family continued existing without me, telling stories that softened their guilt, rewriting history in quieter rooms. I didn't correct them. I didn't return. I didn't need the last word. The life I was building spoke more clearly than any confrontation ever could, and in that silence, I finally understood that the most complete revenge is not humiliation or collapse, but becoming so far beyond reach that your absence hurts more than your presence ever did. The final shift happened so gradually that even I didn't recognize it at first. The anger that had once sharpened every decision faded into something colder and more efficient, not forgiveness but detachment. I stopped thinking of what I was doing as revenge at all. It became governance, stewardship, construction of a life that could not be disrupted by anyone else's approval or rejection. The island systems ran smoothly, investments matured into influence, and people who worked with me learned quickly that I didn't reward loyalty born of fear or ambition, only competence and discretion. That alone changed everything. Decisions stopped being emotional. Outcomes became predictable. Somewhere during that period, my father officially stepped down from active leadership. There was no scandal, no announcement worthy of headlines, just a quiet transition framed as strategic succession. I read about it days later in a brief industry note and felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, no sadness. Just confirmation. Confirmation that time had completed the work I started the night I was told to leave. A mutual contact later mentioned that my father still spoke of me occasionally, not with anger anymore but with a kind of reverence that bordered on myth, as if I had become a lesson rather than a person. I understood then that he would never truly see me again, not as his child and not as his equal, but as a consequence he could never undo. On another New Year's Eve, as the world counted down loudly, I stayed inside, reviewing long-term projections, planning expansions that would take decades to fully unfold. The fireworks outside were distant and unnecessary. I didn't need markers of time anymore. My life no longer reset annually based on other people's calendars. It moved forward on my terms, uninterrupted, self-contained. The night my father shouted for me to leave had been meant to end me. Instead, it stripped away every illusion that kept me small. They thought they were closing a door on me, but in doing so they locked themselves into a world that could never grow beyond its own arrogance. I walked away from that house with one bag and no support, and I built something that would outlast their names, not to prove a point, not to reclaim a place, but because survival without dignity is just another form of exile, and I had already been exiled once. I would never allow it again. Years later, when people ask how it felt to win, I never answered directly because winning implies an opponent still matters, and by then they didn't. What mattered was how completely my life had detached from the version they tried to define. The island expanded not outward but inward, becoming a place where decisions were measured in decades, not quarters, where every structure had redundancy and every agreement had silence built into it. I funded projects that would never carry my name and dismantled systems that depended on visibility to survive. Power, I learned, ages better when it stays unnamed. Occasionally, someone new would arrive at the island, invited through channels so indirect they couldn't trace them afterward, and they would look around with the same disbelief I once felt, asking quietly how something like this could exist without the world knowing. I always told them the same thing, that the world knows only what it's taught to look for. Somewhere far away, my father grew old in rooms that echoed too much, surrounded by people who waited for instructions that never came. His legacy became something analysts debated instead of something leaders feared. The family name still existed, but it no longer opened doors automatically, and that erosion, slow and undeniable, was the final outcome he had never imagined. I never attended his final public appearance, never watched the speech where he spoke about resilience and hard lessons learned, but I heard one line quoted back to me later, a line where he said the future belonged to those who underestimated silence. I almost smiled at that. On the island, another year turned without ceremony. No countdown, no applause, just the steady rhythm of waves and systems humming beneath stone walls built to endure. I had not returned to prove anything. I had not stayed away to punish anyone. I had simply continued forward, uninterrupted, until the distance between who I was and who they thought I'd be became so vast that comparison was no longer possible. And that, more than any confrontation or confession, was the ending they never got to witness. Eventually even memory softened its edges. The living room where it happened lost its sharpness in my mind, replaced by the certainty of motion, of days structured by intention instead of reaction. People began to associate decisions with outcomes that benefited them without ever knowing where those decisions originated, and that anonymity became the strongest shield I had. I was no longer reacting to the past, but designing a future that could not be interrupted by it. Once, during a routine review, I was informed that my father's former residence had been sold quietly, without ceremony, downsized into something practical and unremarkable. The house where I had been told to leave no longer belonged to anyone who remembered that night. It felt fitting. Places, like people, lose meaning when the power that defined them disappears. I authorized a final restructuring that removed the last indirect dependency his old company had on my networks, not out of mercy but because closure sometimes requires completion rather than continuation. From that moment on, our paths no longer intersected even in abstraction. On the island, seasons changed subtly, marked not by weather but by progress, by systems reaching maturity, by plans moving from concept to inevitability. I mentored quietly, invested patiently, and refused every invitation that came with publicity attached. When asked why I stayed hidden, I explained that visibility is a liability once you understand how easily it can be manipulated. Late one night, standing at the edge of the cliffs, I realized something that would have frightened the person I used to be. I no longer needed the story of what they did to me. It had served its purpose, shaped my resolve, sharpened my discipline, and then dissolved. I didn't forgive them, but I didn't carry them either. They existed somewhere behind me, smaller with every step forward. The future no longer required their absence to feel complete, because I had built a world where my presence was enough. There came a point when even the word family stopped carrying weight, when it became just another abstract concept rather than a wound or a warning. I noticed it one morning while reviewing reports, realizing that weeks had passed without a single thought of them crossing my mind. Not consciously avoiding, not suppressing, simply absent. That was when I understood the final stage had arrived, not victory, not revenge, but irrelevance. My days filled with long-term architecture, decisions whose impact would be felt long after names faded, frameworks designed to function without dependence on personalities. People around me spoke carefully, not out of fear but respect, because consistency is more convincing than force. Somewhere in the world my father's name appeared less frequently, his past achievements slowly reclassified as history rather than influence. He had become someone others referenced instead of someone they deferred to. The island thrived quietly, not as a symbol but as a system, self-sustaining, adaptive, insulated from the volatility that once defined my life. On another ordinary evening, with no calendar significance attached, I watched the horizon darken and understood that the story had ended long ago without ceremony. There was no final confrontation waiting, no apology that would arrive late, no reconciliation worth imagining. The night I was told to leave had been framed as an ending, but it was only the removal of an obstacle I hadn't yet recognized. Everything that followed was not a reaction but an expansion. I didn't rebuild myself out of spite, and I didn't succeed to prove a point. I moved forward because staying would have meant shrinking to fit a space designed to diminish me. Now, standing in a world I shaped deliberately and without permission, I knew with certainty that the most brutal outcome for those who tried to erase me was not that I remembered them, but that I no longer had to. Time stretched on, and the world I had built began to feel more real than the one I had been exiled from. Decisions made decades ago by people who had never believed in me now worked silently in my favor. Companies I had acquired or influenced operated as if autonomous, yet every critical outcome funneled subtly through systems I controlled. I rarely interfered, rarely corrected, rarely even observed directly. That absence became my invisible hand, shaping markets, influencing power, controlling outcomes without acknowledgement. Meanwhile, my father, once so certain, drifted into irrelevance quietly, publicly maintaining a veneer of control while privately existing in a shrinking sphere of influence. Friends and associates whispered about the decline of the empire, but none suspected why. They didn't see the invisible architect who had quietly supplanted control with precision. On the island, the castle no longer felt like refuge, it felt inevitable. Every corridor, every room, every system reflected decades of careful planning and autonomy. I rarely left, rarely spoke publicly, rarely interfered. Power now rested in invisibility, in patience, in the ability to act through structures instead of personalities. And with each year, as celebrations, milestones, and anniversaries came and went elsewhere, I realized that the most complete revenge had been achieved not in confrontation, but in absence, in the quiet accumulation of inevitability, in becoming untouchable without anyone needing to know I existed. I didn't look back, I didn't gloat, and I didn't celebrate. I simply continued forward, unbroken, undisturbed, unchallenged, while the world I had left behind slowly recognized its own dependency too late. Eventually, even memory became a tool rather than a burden. I began to reconstruct my understanding of the world not in reaction to my father or the family that had abandoned me, but through deliberate expansion of systems, influence, and networks I had never needed to announce. I monitored markets, acquisitions, and contracts silently, letting outcomes ripple through industries without my name attached, and the very invisibility became my greatest leverage. Occasionally I would hear through indirect channels that my father's company had missed a critical opportunity, that executives blamed delays and miscommunication, that contracts were renegotiated under less favorable terms, all consequences of choices I had orchestrated years before. He never realized I had orchestrated them. My half-brother attempted to maintain relevance, but every effort was tempered by the subtle infrastructures I had already positioned around him, limiting leverage without appearing involved. My stepmother retreated into social circles that no longer mattered, her influence quietly eroding while I expanded in silence. The island became not just home but the center of a network of controlled yet invisible influence, a place where decisions moved worlds quietly, efficiently, and permanently. One night, while standing at the edge of the cliffs watching the waves crash, I realized that revenge had never been about destruction. It had been about endurance, about outlasting, about creating a life so entirely self-sufficient that absence alone carried the weight of consequence. And in that understanding, the final satisfaction emerged, not rage, not triumph, not acknowledgement, but certainty. They had removed me from their lives thinking they punished me, and instead, they had handed me the freedom to become absolute. Every new year, every anniversary, every passing season reminded me not of what they had done, but of what I had become, and I finally understood that true power is measured not by confrontation, but by the silence of those who no longer matter. With every passing year, the separation from my old life became more complete. Names, faces, even memories of their voices lost their sharp edges, replaced by a clarity I had never possessed before, clarity that came from complete autonomy. I no longer measured my worth against anyone else's approval, no longer gauged success by comparison, and no longer allowed absence to be interpreted as weakness. On the island, I expanded operations subtly, building influence that spanned continents while remaining unseen. Decisions that affected markets, contracts, and corporate hierarchies passed through my systems quietly, often credited to others, often unnoticed, yet the outcomes were undeniable. I learned that control without visibility is the most absolute form of power. It cannot be challenged, cannot be undermined, cannot be anticipated. Meanwhile, far away, my father aged visibly in ways that words cannot describe, his once confident posture shrinking, his voice losing authority, his decisions becoming hesitant. The world still recognized his name, but only as a shadow of its former significance. My stepmother and half-brother existed in that diminished sphere, their ambitions tethered to a man who no longer dictated outcomes. They were trapped in the consequences of underestimating me, consequences that required no active intervention on my part. On quiet nights, as I walked along the cliffs of my island, listening to the ocean and the wind, I realized that the most complete revenge is neither confrontation nor humiliation, it is detachment and irrelevance. I did not gloat. I did not boast. I simply continued to exist, build, and expand in ways that no one could touch, until those who had cast me out understood, silently and irrevocably, that their actions had created something they would never reach, never control, never undo. Freedom, autonomy, permanence, that had been the outcome they never imagined, the endgame of a life once dismissed. Time stretched on, and the realization settled fully. I no longer needed their acknowledgement, their apologies, or even their awareness. The island had become more than a home, it was a command center, a sanctuary, and a testament to foresight, patience, and strategy. Every structure, every system, every relationship I cultivated operated on timelines measured in decades, immune to the whims of people who had once thought they defined me. Occasionally, fragments of my old life appeared in news articles or whispered conversations, a deal my father's company lost, a merger delayed, a partner reneging under pressure. I never acted on these. I let them happen, allowed consequences to ripple naturally, invisible, inevitable. My father's world contracted slowly, his influence became more symbolic than practical. My stepmother retreated further into irrelevant social spheres. My half-brother's ambitions diminished under the subtle weight of the structures I had positioned without anyone's knowledge. They did not understand that the most devastating consequence was not financial or public, it was structural and psychological, the complete invisibility of the person they once thought they controlled. And I watched from the cliffs, the endless sea stretching beyond, thinking that the night I was told to leave had not ended me but released me. The exile they intended as punishment became a catalyst, the door they closed became the space in which I built a world immune to their influence. I did not return, I did not gloat, I did not send warnings. I simply continued, unshaken, unchallenged, unstoppable. Freedom had replaced anger. Autonomy had replaced revenge. The past existed only as context, and the future was mine entirely, sculpted with precision, patience, and permanence, an empire no one could touch, not even the family that had once dismissed me. Years continued to pass, and with each one the distance between my old life and my new world grew absolute. I no longer measured myself by their standards, nor did I feel the sting of their judgments. The island became a living system, each facility, each operation, each connection flowing seamlessly into the next. Influence traveled quietly through networks I controlled, shaping markets and decisions without anyone knowing the architect behind the outcomes. My father's presence in the world dwindled further, his authority became a memory everyone referenced but no one relied upon. My stepmother and half-brother operated in diminished spheres, their ambitions hampered by the invisible framework I had already installed. Occasionally, I heard second-hand reports of small failures, miscalculations, and delays, none significant enough to be catastrophic, but all evidence of their lost advantage. I didn't act to exploit them, I let the natural consequences unfold, a silent reminder that absence can be more powerful than interference. On nights when the ocean was calm and the wind carried no sound, I walked the cliffs and understood that my existence alone was the statement, that my freedom and autonomy had become a presence that could never be contested. Revenge had long ceased to be an emotion, it was a state of being. They had tried to erase me, and in doing so had created the conditions for a life that was untouchable, unassailable, and permanent. I did not look back. I did not seek recognition. I continued forward, building, expanding, and existing, knowing that the greatest punishment for those who abandoned me was not humiliation or confrontation, but the undeniable fact that their absence no longer mattered, and that my life had moved beyond anything they could influence. Eventually, even the passage of time itself became an ally. Years folded over one another, yet nothing in my world felt rushed or imposed. The island thrived silently, its infrastructure, investments, and networks operating with the precision of decades-long planning. I no longer measured success by wealth, influence, or recognition. I measured it by permanence, by systems that could endure beyond any individual's ambition or folly. News from the mainland arrived indirectly, whispers of my father's company faltering in minor ways, deals delayed or lost, initiatives quietly undermined by inefficiencies that I had long anticipated. I never intervened. I let the consequences settle naturally, watching without emotion as the structures I had created slowly encased the world they had tried to control. My father's authority diminished further with each passing year. His decisions grew hesitant, his voice lost its conviction, his presence in meetings became perfunctory. My stepmother withdrew into a quiet irrelevance, her influence fading without public notice. My half-brother attempted to maintain relevance but discovered that ambition without leverage is impotent. None of them knew why their world was contracting, they only felt the effect, the slow erosion of certainty. And I understood that the final, most absolute revenge had already been achieved. Invisibility had replaced confrontation, endurance had replaced rage, autonomy had replaced dependency. I no longer needed them, and the life I had created existed entirely beyond their reach. On quiet nights, I stood on the balcony, listening to the waves crash against cliffs older than empires, and realized that the moment they thought they punished me had instead delivered me into a freedom and power they would never comprehend. The exile they intended to break me had made me untouchable, permanent, and unstoppable, and that truth, silent and complete, was the conclusion they would never witness. Decades blurred, and with each passing year, the weight of their absence became indistinguishable from the natural order of my life. The island was no longer merely a sanctuary or a fortress, it had become a self-sustaining ecosystem, a world operating seamlessly on systems, networks, and influence I had designed with quiet precision. Every investment matured, every operation refined, and every connection strengthened without my presence needing acknowledgement. Occasionally, news reached me through indirect channels. My father's company delayed a merger, a boardroom decision faltered, partnerships dissolved, but I never interfered. Letting the consequences unfold naturally was far more devastating than any act of vengeance I could have enacted. My father's influence shrank steadily, his decisions became cautious, his authority questioned internally, and the aura of invincibility he once commanded dissolved. My stepmother retreated further into irrelevance, her social and corporate influence quietly evaporating. My half-brother attempted maneuvers to regain footholds but was subtly outpaced and outmaneuvered by systems I had already laid in place. They never knew the architect behind their gradual loss, and they never would. I realized fully then that the ultimate revenge is not confrontation or exposure, but permanent attachment, the creation of a life so complete, so autonomous, that those who once sought to control or erase you are rendered irrelevant. Standing once again on the cliffs at sunset, feeling the endless wind and the steady rhythm of the ocean, I understood that my exile had never been punishment, it had been liberation. Every choice they made against me, every dismissal, every act of abandonment, had become the foundation of my unassailable existence. They had cast me out, and I had built a world beyond their reach. The life they intended to break was now a fortress of permanence, of influence, and of quiet inevitability, and the only sound that mattered was the wind, the waves, and the certainty that they could never undo what had been created in their absence. Years passed like currents, each one folding into the next, yet nothing in my world felt hurried or fragile. The island had grown beyond a residence or an empire, it was a living mechanism, perfectly attuned to sustain itself, to operate without dependence on fleeting human ambition. Every operation matured quietly, every investment ripened, every connection expanded under the invisible architecture I had created. Occasionally, news drifted in from the mainland. My father's company stumbled again, deals faltered, ambitions misfired, but I remained absent. I did not act, because letting consequence unfold with precision is far more brutal than interference. My father aged into caution, his voice faltering, his authority diminished, the confidence that once radiated now replaced by hesitancy. My stepmother's influence faded into irrelevance, unremarked upon. My half-brother attempted strategies to regain footing, yet each move I had anticipated subtly redirected, slowed, or neutralized, though they never understood how. And then one evening, standing at the balcony of the castle as the sun bled gold into the horizon, I understood with absolute clarity that the world I had been expelled from existed now only as a shadow. I realized that revenge had never been about rage or retaliation. It had been about permanence, invisibility, and inevitability. They had thought exile was punishment, I had built freedom. They had believed erasure could diminish me, I had built influence they could not touch. I had transformed abandonment into autonomy, ridicule into resilience, dismissal into dominance. And yet, the final triumph was not material or measurable, it was existential. I had become untouchable, unassailable, a force whose existence no longer depended on their recognition. I turned from the balcony and walked into the heart of my fortress, the ocean's endless rhythm at my back, and I smiled, not for them, not for victory, but because the night they told me to leave had become the first day of a life that would endure beyond their comprehension. Somewhere far away, they remembered me only in fragments, never fully grasping that their cruelty had catalyzed my sovereignty. And as the last light faded behind the cliffs, I whispered to no one, not in triumph but in quiet certainty, you tried to erase me, and instead you built me immortal. The wind carried my words into the horizon, the waves responded with endless rhythm, and the world turned unaware, unknowing, while I finally understood that exile had been the greatest gift they could ever give, a gift I had transformed into a kingdom no one could touch, a life no one could undo, and a legacy they would never see coming.